On December 7th, 1993, Colin Ferguson, a 35-year-old man, boarded a Long Island Railroad train in New York City. Once the train had left the station, Ferguson stood up and began firing a handgun at passengers, killing 6 and injuring 19 others. The attack lasted for several minutes before other passengers were able to subdue Ferguson and hold him down until police arrived. Colin Ferguson was born in Kingston, Jamaica on the 14th of January 1958 to Von Herman and May Ferguson. Von Herman was a wealthy pharmacist and director of a large pharmaceutical company. He was described as one of the most prominent businessmen in Jamaica. Colin attended the Calabar High School in the Red Hills Road, Kingston, from 1969 to 1974, where the principal described him as a well-rounded student. This is where Ferguson would first show his academic gifts, as he would graduate in the top third of his class. At age 20, Colin would experience tragedy in the family when his father, Von Herman, was killed in a car crash, and then shortly after this, his mother would lose her battle with cancer and die. Those tragedies ruined the family's fortunes and deeply disturbed the mind of Colin Ferguson. In 1982, aged 24, Colin would move to the United States on a visitor's visa. However, his misfortunes would continue in the US, where he had trouble dealing with the racism and was further frustrated because he couldn't find work outside of menial jobs. Shortly after moving to the US, he married a woman by the name of Audrey Warren, which qualified him for permanent US residency. The couple then moved in together in a house in Long Island. However, their relationship was turbulent, with the pair fighting often, sometimes to the point that police intervention was necessary. The marriage wouldn't last long, lasting only 2 years before Audrey divorced Colin. Along with the constant arguments and fights, she claimed the reason for the divorce was a difference in social views. Although Colin was antagonistic to Audrey, the divorce was still a crushing blow. In the years following the divorce, Colin was working in New York when he injured his head and neck while standing on a stool chair to reach invoices from a filing cabinet. This accident led Ferguson to file a complaint with the State Workers' Compensation Agency in hopes of compensation. This accident left Colin out of work, which may explain why, later that year, he enrolled in Nassau Community College. Here, he showcased his academic abilities, making the Dean's List 3 times. However, his stay here wasn't without issue. On one occasion, he was forced to leave class after acting overly aggressive towards the teacher. This could be why, in late 1990, he would transfer to Adelphi University in Garden City. During his time at Adelphi University, he developed a notoriety for his racist beliefs. He often spoke out against coexisting with whites, routinely made calls for retribution, and regularly accused others around him of racism. On one occasion, he complained that a white woman in the library shouted racial epithets at him after he asked her about a class assignment, but an investigation concluded that this incident never occurred. Later, he attended a symposium by a faculty member discussing her experience in South Africa under apartheid. Ferguson interrupted the professor by shouting,
"We should be talking about the revolution in South Africa and how to get rid of the white people."
He also shouted,
"Kill everyone white."
Students and teachers tried to quiet him, but he started threatening them, repeatedly saying,
"The Black Revolution will get you."
Following this incident, he was suspended from the school in June 1991. Later that year, he would move to Flatbush, Brooklyn, where he would rent a room. His neighbors would mention that he often dressed nicely, however, he kept to himself and would rarely smile or interact with the neighbors outside of the occasional hello. Colin's landlord didn't have such a good view of him, however. He said he had delusions of grandeur and that he walks around like he's such a good person and only white people are holding him back. In 1992, Colin would have another outburst while on the subway, which resulted in him being arrested and charged with harassment. The situation began when a woman tried to sit in the vacant seat alongside Colin, when she asked him to move over. This prompted Colin to scream at her and press his leg and elbow against her until the police arrived and pinned Colin to the ground. Colin would write letters to the police following this arrest, complaining it was racist and he was brutalized by the officers who arrested him. However, following an investigation by the New York City Transit Authority, the claims were dismissed. Going forward to September 1992, Colin would be awarded $26,250 for his workplace accident. Colin would try to reopen this claim to receive more money for medical care, however, he was unsuccessful. A few months later, in April 1993, Colin would move to California in search of new career opportunities. However, again, he was unsuccessful. While in California, Collins purchased a Ruger P-89 for $400. He claimed the reason was he'd been robbed by two men, so he began carrying a pistol with him in a paper bag for safety. The next month, in May 1993, Colin had moved back to his old apartment in Flatbush. He had told a friend the reason was he didn't like competing with immigrants and Hispanics for jobs. One person who definitely wasn't happy to see Colin again was his landlord. He remarked that Colin was even more unstable upon his return, talking in third person and ranting about some scenario in which black people rise up and strike down their pompous rulers and oppressors. His deranged behaviors didn't end there, however. He began to shower 5 times a day and neighbors would hear him repeatedly chanting all night.
All the black people killing all the white people.
This made the landlord increasingly concerned about Colin's obsession with racism and apparent growing mental instability. So much so that he would ask Colin to move out by the end of the month. In the last 2 weeks before his eruption on the Long Island Railroad, Colin Ferguson changed. His landlord recalled, after more than 2 years of reading his Bible aloud each night and ranting against white people and the evils of racism, Mr. Ferguson suddenly grew quiet.
I think in the last 2 weeks he was deciding what he was going to do. I guess he wanted to make sure his fury level was at a peak. He was very quiet, incredibly quiet. He didn't play his radio and he stopped praying for the first time in a very long time. This kind of alarmed me. Just before those 2 weeks we did ask him to leave, because I got the feeling I just couldn't reason with him anymore. I got the feeling one day I was going to walk in and his door would be half open and I might see him swinging on a rope.
Instead, Mr. Ferguson scribbled some notes, loaded his 9mm pistol, put 160 rounds of additional ammunition in his pocket and left his room for the last time about 4 p.m. He went to Pennsylvania Station and boarded the 5:33 to Hicksville, a 12-car train crowded with homebound commuters. He sat in the rear of the third car, a heavy-set man in a tanned windbreaker, hardly remarkable among the rows of people reading newspapers and dozing. Darkness had walled in the windows, occasionally filled with lights of passing stations. As the train approached Garden City, he got up and turned towards his victims. Drawing his gun, Collins opened fire at random, slowly walking along the car, pulling his trigger methodically. While many passengers tried to run along to the next car to escape, several others tried hiding beneath their seats. Working his way down the car, Collins would shoot people hiding to his right and left as he passed the seats, briefly facing each victim before firing, all the while repeating to himself and to his victims,
"I'm going to get you."
During the last 3 minutes, Collins had emptied 2 15-round magazines, killing 6 and injuring 17, with another 2 being injured by the stampeding passengers trying to escape. While reloading his 3rd magazine, a passenger yelled out to grab him. Passengers Michael O'Connor, Kevin Blum, and Mark McKenty tackled him and pinned him to one of the train's seats. Several other passengers ran forward to grab his arms and legs and helped to pin him across a 3-seat row with his head facing towards the window and legs towards the aisle.
What I saw was Mr. Ferguson drop the gun that he had just fired. I threw down my bag kept going towards him, grabbed him by the chest. He said, "I will not resist." As I was on top of him, he said, "You're hurting me. Please don't hurt me. A very bad thing has happened here. In the morning, this will all be over." We wrestled him into one of the seats over here. We got him down, pinned down. I think Kevin was on his chest. He yelled, "Don't hurt me." A couple other things. And that was it.
5 to 6 people continued to hold Collins down for several minutes until Andrew Roderick, an off-duty police officer who had planned to pick up his wife from the train station, boarded the train and handcuffed him.
I asked numerous people what was going on, and they told me there was a man with a gun, and he was in the third car, and he had just shot a whole bunch of people. There were bodies laying in the vestibule area, also in the aisleway itself. Two females. There were shell casings laying all over the place.
Did you smell anything?
Yes, I smelled gunpowder, and I also smelled the smell of human blood. I told him, "Do not move," as I was attempting to, pull his arms back and put the handcuffs on. "Don't move." He told me, "I'm not going anywhere." Yeah, I did it.
During the shooting, many passengers complained they were unable to exit the car once it was stopped, and that they'd heard a voice over the train's intercom instructing conductors not to open the doors. This was because 85 foot from Garden City's Maryland Avenue station, an engineer had become aware of the shooting and put on the train's emergency brakes. This had stopped the train with the first 10 cars at the station, but with the last 2 cars short of the platform. The engineer was concerned that passengers would fall to the tracks if the doors were opened, so he made the announcement not to open the doors. Luckily for the passengers, the conductor in a small cab at the opposite end of the car, where Collins had opened fire, had heard several shots and tried to leave his cab to find out what was happening. However, with all the stampeding passengers, he was unable to get past. Understanding the situation, he climbed out of a window onto the platform and used his key to open the doors to the car from the outside so passengers could get to safety. Colin Ferguson's trial was interesting, to say the least. Collins was originally appointed an attorney by the state. He would have attempted to go with an insanity defense. We know this because he had called for his client to receive a psychiatric evaluation, which is necessary under New York state law to pursue an insanity defense, as the attorney needs to prove their client's mental faculties were inefficient during the time of the crime and were unable to determine right from wrong. However, in Colin Ferguson's case, this seemed to be a hard case to argue, as he seemed to have planned the attack. If you recall, I mentioned before the shooting, Collins had scribbled some notes. Also, when he was wrestled to the ground, he had shown remorse for his action. These both seemed to indicate he was of sound mind during the shooting.
The racism of Governor Cuomo's staff and the executive chamber, the racism of the lieutenant governor's staff, for the corrupt black attorneys who not only refused to help me, but tried to steal my car. Spoke about the civil rights leaders here, the sloppy running of the number 2 train. It is racism by Caucasians. Talks about those filthy swines that live at 226 Martenth Street, his own address.
A week after being appointed his first attorney, Collins asked for a replacement. He told the judge he questioned his integrity and disagreed with his handling of the case and refused to cooperate with him. Collins did suggest a second attorney, and they had agreed to work together before the attorney withdrew his offer, stating a conflict he refused to elaborate on. Dr. Alan Reichman, a psychiatrist who interviewed Ferguson, indicated in his report that Ferguson may have been feigning mental illness when he spoke of conspiracies against him. Reichman said Ferguson's assertions were vague and somewhat evasive, in contrast to the normally detailed and highly focused nature of paranoid or delusional thinking. However, on January 5, 1994, a report by the court-appointed psychologist and psychiatrist concluded Ferguson was suffering from paranoid personality disorder, but was competent to stand trial. On January 19, 1994, after 3 days of evidence presentation, a grand jury handed up a 93-count indictment against Ferguson, which carried the possibility of up to 175 years in prison. The indictment included 2 counts of murder for each slain victim. both for international murder and depraved indifference to human life. It also included 19 counts of attempted murder, 34 counts of assault, criminal possession of a firearm, intent to use the weapon, violation of civil rights of each of the 25 victims, and intent to harass, annoy, threaten, and alarm the victims because of their race, color, or national origins. On March 1, 1994, William Kunstler and Ron Kuby, two infamous law partners known for representing unpopular clients, announced they had accepted a request by Ferguson to handle his case. William Kunstler claimed that Ferguson had been made out to be a pariah by the media and public. Kunstler and Kuby proposed an innovative defense. They claimed Ferguson had been driven to temporary insanity by a psychiatric condition they termed black rage. They argued Ferguson had been driven insane by racial prejudice and could not be held criminally liable for his actions, even though he had committed the killings. One of the things they pointed to were Ferguson's notes. They claimed they showed he was motivated by rage during the shooting. Donald Belfi, the judge that was assigned to the Ferguson case, criticized Kunstler for speaking to the media about the proposed defense before it had been examined by a mental health professional. Belfi said, "Mr. Kunstler may have many talents, but until he receives his medical degree with a specialty in psychiatry, these types of conclusions should be left for medical experts." One of the biggest opposers to this defense was Colin Ferguson himself, as he had begun to claim he was not involved in the Long Island Railroad shooting at all. He had also told Kunstler and Kuby that he was receiving messages straight from God, and spoke of conspiracies to destroy those who opposed God. The seeming spiral of Colin Ferguson's mental health led his attorneys to ask the judge to reconsider Ferguson's competency to stand trial. George Peck, the prosecutor in the trial, believed that this was a defense tactic employed by Ferguson to avoid trial. On August 20th, 1994, Ferguson appeared before the judge and rejected his lawyer's efforts to have him declared mentally unfit to stand trial. Ferguson spoke in a long and rambling manner, occasionally ignoring the judge when he tried to interrupt him. One of the claims Colin made was that a police officer escorting him from Nassau County Jail had told him, "You realize someone else, in fact, was actually responsible for the shooting." Kunstler and Kuby argued Ferguson's behavior was indicative of his mental imbalance, but the judge refused the lawyer's request to reconsider his competence, citing the original psychiatric report that concluded Ferguson was able to understand the charges against him, and was malingering in an attempt to create an impression that he was mentally imbalanced and unable to cooperate with his attorneys. This meeting ended with more drama. As Ferguson was handcuffed, he shouted that they were too tight before collapsing to the floor and being dragged out of the courtroom by officers. On September the 20th, Kunstler and Kuby went ahead and filed that they would be pursuing an insanity defense despite the objections of their client. Ferguson, however, continued to claim he was not involved in the shooting and proposed to defend himself during the trial. In the following months, Ferguson sent Judge Belfi several letters regarding disputes between himself, Kunstler, and Kuby. Ferguson claimed in the letters that he was not insane and rejected Kunstler and Kuby's black rage defense. Although George Peck argued that the letters proved Ferguson was able to understand the charges against him and was actively participating in his defense, Kuby argued that the letters only further demonstrated Ferguson's confused state of mind. On November 11th, Ferguson agreed that he would stop resisting efforts to meet with the court-appointed psychiatrist. As a result, Judge Belfi agreed to hold a third hearing as to whether Ferguson was mentally competent to stand trial. On the 10th of December, Judge Belfi ruled Ferguson was competent to stand trial. Judge Belfi said he based his decision in part with his conversations with Ferguson in the courtroom. The judge strongly advised Ferguson against defending himself, but Ferguson said he intended to do so anyway. Kuby had the following to say regarding the decision. "What we will now have is a complete circus. A crazy man cannot defend himself. Mr. Ferguson, evidence to the contrary, believes he is not guilty and that someone else killed all those people aboard the train. Without a psychiatric defense, Ferguson has no defense. There was no doubt that he was there, that he fired the weapon, and that he would have fired it more had he not been wrestled to the ground. There is no doubt that Colin Ferguson, if sane, was guilty. With Ferguson defending himself, the trial proved to be bizarre, as he cross-examined the police officers that arrested him and the victims that he shot.
This is a case of stereotype victimization of a black man. The only time you have seen the suspect is on TV. Am I correct?
I saw you shoot me, and I've seen you on TV.
Ultimately, Ferguson would argue that this was a case of racial stereotyping and that he was innocent. He admitted to bringing the gun onto the train, however, he claimed that he had fallen asleep and another man had grabbed his gun and committed the murders. He would seem to be well-spoken and lucid at parts, then the next moments would seem to be ramblings of a madman.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's no mystery about this case. Within the first 5 or 6 witnesses, you're going to see enough to know that this man was the shooter.
So Mr. Peck reading from an accusatory instrument called an indictment. This is simply an instrument which brings a defendant into court to face trial. It is not in any way an admission of guilt by a defendant. It is not in any way a confirmation of guilt by a defendant, but it is simply charges that are brought against the defendant by way of a grand jury. There were 93 counts to that indictment. 93 counts, only because it matches the year 1993. Had it been 1925, it would have been 25 counts.
During the trial, while cross-examining his victims, Ferguson would refer to himself in the third person, leading to strange interactions. Mary Ann Phillips, the first victim shot by Colin Ferguson, recounts the event.
I'm sitting there reading the newspaper, literally in my own little world, kind of not seeing the outside world at all. Through my peripheral vision, I could see someone stand up directly next to me, and it made me turn to that person and look at them, away from my newspaper, and as I turned, I saw Mr. Colin Ferguson.
Now, at that time, what did he do?
He looked me dead in the eye, and pointed the gun, and with the most serious look I have ever seen on anyone's face, he shot me in the chest. I felt the bullet come over here, over my left breast, exited right here, and I know that's where it is because that's where my scar is. The same bullet re-entered my arm about here, shattered all of my arm into almost granules of sand, and the bullet wound up right down.
After Phillips was shot, she closed her eyes and pretended to be dead so that she would not be shot again. Ferguson would argue that she did not actually see him, and it was in fact a case of mistaken identity.
Would you say the description you gave of 5'10", 5'11 inches tall, stocky build, short hair, in his 30s could fit just about any person?
That sustained.
It was your statement that you played dead?
Yes.
And did that involve closing your eyes?
Yes, it did.
So you wanted the person who was doing the shooting to think that you were dead?
Yes, I didn't want you to shoot me again.
So you were not able to see anything, correct? Because your eyes were closed.
After being shot, I saw you shoot me.
Other victims, Frank Barber, Robert Giuliano, Kevin Zaleski, Lisa Combari, John Forney, Jill Michael, Mark Haney, John Aspel, and Elizabeth Avels recall similar experiences as Colin Ferguson shot them.
I heard popping sounds.
I thought that some kid had thrown firecrackers into the train.
I saw the shooter walking up the aisle towards me, looking into seats with his right hand extended.
He looked me in the eyes, square in the face. I'm looking at you right now. And he pointed his gun at me.
He had the gun pointed at me. He then opened fire on me.
A bullet entered my left hand across the palm, came through my left thumb, shattering the thumb, entered my neck, and proceeded up into my mouth where it lodged in my tongue. I just kind of was frantic, and I stated, I have 7 children. I can't die in this train.
He shot me 5 times. I was bleeding pretty bad from both my arms, and they tied tourniquets on my arms to try and slow the blood down.
I was shot in the forehead.
The bullet, when it entered me and it went off my rib.
I felt a bullet hit me in the left buttock area.
Oh, I was shot 2 times or 3 times. I didn't know really how many times, but things go through your head, you know. You just had the sweats and burning and sort like that. I just didn't know. I mean, you get shot with a gun, I thought, chances are you don't make it.
I had an entrance and an exit wound to my right shoulder.
Lisa Combati, who was 7 months pregnant at the time, along with the other victims, watched in horror as dead bodies and blood filled the train. Robert Giuliano and Lisa Combati recall one of the murders that haunted them both. That was the death of Maria Magtodo, a 30-year-old Westbury lawyer who was the passenger sitting next to Robert Giuliano.
Back of her head or her head, it exploded. I saw her on the floor in front of me, blood all over.
That was a vision that haunted me for weeks and weeks. Just at what a beautiful face she was, and I just knew that she was dead.
When I went home that night, I told my wife after I saw it, this beautiful girl with an angelic face came on the train, and 2 minutes later, she was dead at my feet. Her blood was on my pants.
Another victim, Kevin McCarthy, who was aboard the train with his father during the shooting, recalls the injuries he was dealt that left him partially paralyzed.
I remember leaving Penn Station and then hearing an undistinguished sound. And, hearing people talk next to me about me sliding my hand along the bar that was in front of my seat.
Did you lose part of your brain cells?
Yes, I lost an estimated 10% of my brain.
What about your skull?
A portion of my skull was replaced by a titanium mesh plate.
Dennis McCarthy, his father, unfortunately didn't survive his attack. Despite all of Colin Ferguson's efforts, not a single victim struggled to identify him as the shooter.
Do you recognize that person who saw the shooting in courtroom today?
Yes, I do.
He's the gentleman in the brown jacket at the second table.
Oh, he's the fellow with the brown jacket and a brown tie.
That individual right there.
Be more specific.
There are 2 individuals sitting at the table behind Detective Parpan. It's the one on the left with the brown suit on.
The gentleman sitting at the defense table in the center, brown jacket.
Mr. Ferguson.
Looking at the footage, it is unclear as to what exactly Colin Ferguson was aiming to get out of some of his questions during cross-examination. Take the cross-examination of Robert Giuliano, for example.
And is it your testimony that blood was on your foot?
Yes.
And was it your testimony that it was Maria Magtodo's blood?
That's correct.
Did you see when that blood splashed on your foot?
Did I see when it splashed?
Yes.
No, I didn't see when it splashed, no.
And it's your testimony that you were shot?
Yes.
One of the victims that grew increasingly frustrated from her attacker's questionings was Elizabeth Avils.
Did there come a time when you heard a pop?
Yeah, when you got up out of your seat,
Who did you see shot first?
I saw you shoot someone to the north side of the train, which is your left.
Is it your testimony under Mr. Peck's questioning that you saw no one shot?
I saw you shooting everyone on the train, okay?
The state would call a series of pathologists and ballistic experts to the stand. Ballistics expert Joseph Eisel explained his findings matched Colin Ferguson's gun to the crime. Contrary to Ferguson's own opening statement that he was asleep and another man used his gun to shoot the passengers, he would still attempt to disprove the ballistics expert's findings.
Opinion, after looking at numerous exhibits over all these years, that these projectiles were fired from this gun to the exclusion of all other guns. That's my opinion.
That is your opinion only, am I correct?
That's correct.
And that is not the opinion of a second ballistics expert that you do not know, am I correct?
A second that I do not know that has not examined the evidence, but three that I do know that have examined the evidence.
At one point, Ferguson claimed that he had been threatened by one of the detectives during interrogation on the night of the shooting.
Revolver is a 9mm Glock, am I correct?
One of several revolvers, weapons that I have.
But you do have a Glock, am I correct?
One of several, yes.
And was that the gun you held to Mr. Ferguson's head and threatened to blow it open?
Could you repeat that?
Was that the same gun you held to Mr. Ferguson's head at headquarters and threatened to blow it open?
At no time did I ever hold the gun to your head.
On a bizarre request, Ferguson said he'd like to subpoena President Clinton, as the men who had tackled Ferguson during the shooting had met the president following the attack and received medals.
That Mr. President Clinton has had conversations with persons who receive congressional medals coming out of the Long Island Railroad massacre. And therefore these persons might have divulged to President Clinton certain information which they have not told to the court. So you probably wanted to get that type of information from the president. The judge is going to deem it totally irrelevant.
For his defense, Ferguson had planned to call a number of experts to the stand, however none ultimately were. One of the would-be witnesses was a man named Raul Diaz, who claimed to know that this was a cover-up by the government to frame Colin Ferguson.
89, thank you. I went to a Yankee baseball game, okay? And I saw on the field a spirit sticking a spear into Don Mattingly's back.
Ferguson's closing statement more so resembled the ramblings of a madman. He ended his statement with a personal appeal for mercy.
We know the importance of persons who involve themselves in the instruction and the guidance of persons at a very important level of life in our society, a time when there's indecision and indiscretion. There is no greater position, for instance, as a tutor at a high school level. I've always maintained that at that level, which is a lot more important than a college level, in terms of the product that comes out of high schools, and the defense, I believe, has done a commendable job. Vindicate Mr. Ferguson. Do not destroy his life more so than it is already destroyed. His life has been extremely difficult. He has suffered. Look at me and see me as a human being and do to me what is needed to put me back in society.
Mr. Peck, closing remarks. Mr. Ferguson would indicate that this is literally a grand conspiracy participated in by everyone against him. That everyone is against him. In point of fact, he's against the world.
The fact of the matter is, he just likes to hear himself talk. The man hates the world. And he asks you to give him sympathy? God, the suffering he caused.
The jury would deliberate for just one day.
As to count 31, attempted murder in the second degree, what is your verdict?
Guilty.
As to count 60, Attempted murder in the second degree. What is your verdict?
Guilty.
That's it.
After the sentencing, the victims were given a chance to speak to Colin Ferguson.
You have no one to blame but yourself for what a miserable excuse for a human being you are.
I will never understand for the rest of my life why you, Colin Ferguson, murdered my husband as well as the other 5 victims and injured 19 people.
In Maria Magtoto's place, her father addressed her killer.
The greatest injustice is done to our daughter, Marita. She was at the prime of her youth. A brilliant career as a lawyer ahead of her. She is newly married with a vision to build a family, surrounded by healthy and cheerful children. She dreamt of becoming a useful member of society and a credit both to the Filipino and American communities. All these have been shattered to pieces by Ferguson.
On December 7th, 1993, I was sentenced to a life of pain and suffering because of this one man's actions. I did not have the luxury of a trial or appeal. Luxury of a trial or appeal. I was convicted and sentenced by a depraved madman with an assault gun.
I do not believe you're crazy, Colin Ferguson. I believe you knew exactly what you were doing that night. But your justice is now about to be served.
You shot me without any provocation. You have accomplished absolutely nothing except you've wreaked havoc on my life. You've wreaked havoc and you've taken away the lives of people who did absolutely nothing to you.
Unsurprisingly, Ferguson's last words were more incoherent rambling.
Is there anything defendant wishes to say?
Not a smoker. I do not drink alcohol. I do not gamble. I would not get into the whole matter of reading pornography.
On February 17th, 1995, Colin Ferguson was sentenced to 315 years and 8 months for his crimes.
Colin Ferguson, in my almost 21 years as a judge, I have never presided over a trial with a more selfish and self-centered defendant than you. That you, Colin Ferguson, are hereby sentenced to an indeterminate term of imprisonment, the maximum of such sentence for each count to be life, and the minimum of such sentence for each count to be 25 years. These 6 sentences are to run consecutively to each other.
I think with these kind of videos, it's important to end thinking of the victims, and that these are all real people who had hopes and dreams for the future, but they were ripped away by the cold and callous actions of one deranged man.